welcome all of you. And on behalf of the Adelphi Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy, we're glad you're here and we're to our Meet the Author event. My name is Megan Nolan, and I'm the president of ASPP. Tonight, we'll be listening to Dr. Sternberg talk about his most recent book, By Reason of Insanity, A Glimpse into the Lives and Minds of the Criminally Insane. Our workshop will be moderated by Dr. Bob Raymond. Both Dr. Sternberg and Dr. Raymond are faculty members at the postgraduate program at Derner School of Psychology at Adelphi University. A couple of housekeeping rules before we start. Since we have over 140 people registered for the event, everyone's audio will be muted except for the presenters. The presentation will be broken into two parts. Please write your name and any questions or comments in the chat box at the end of each part of the presentation. We will open up the workshop for discussion. If you've written a question or a comment, Dr. Raymond will call on you and ask you to unmute yourself so that you can ask your question. The event is going to be recorded and will be posted in our ASPP website. At this point, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Raymond. Dr. Bob Raymond is one of our own adjunct faculty at Derner's postgraduate program at Adelphi, and he is on the faculty of the Suffolk Institute for Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis. He's a clinical and forensic psychologist who started his career working for the New York City Police Department and went on to work for the New York City Prison Health Services, leading a team of mental health professionals providing services to severely emotionally disturbed prisoners incarcerated at Rikers Island and at the Queens House of Detention. During these early years of his career, Dr. Raymond trained as a forensic psychologist and as a psychoanalyst. He did a postdoctoral internship at Manhattan Psychiatric Hospital, which was next to the Kirby Forensic Psychiatric Center on Wards Island, where Dr. Sternberg worked, though they did not know each other at that time. Dr. Raymond has been in private practice for over 30 years with offices in New York City and then also in Bellport, Long Island, treating individuals and couples, doing forensic evaluations, and assisting families going through life transitions by using a collaborative law team approach. Dr. Raymond is on the executive board at the Adelphi Postgraduate Training Program, and he's the chairman of the Adelphi Committee on Personal Psychoanalysis. So without further ado, I hand it over to you, Dr. Raymond.
Megan, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Richard Sternberg. Dr. Sternberg is a Long Island man. He got his bachelor's degree from Hofstra University. He has 2 master's degrees. One, he had to go into the city. He went to the graduate faculty of the New School for Social Research and got a master's degree in psychology, but then came back to Long Island and got a second master's from Long Island University. He went on and got his doctoral degree in clinical psychology from Long Island University. And after that, he went on to postdoctoral studies here at Adelphi and became certified as a psychoanalyst. And he also completed the postdoctoral program at Adelphi and became certified in marriage and couples therapy. He's a New York licensed psychologist, a certified psychoanalyst, and a board certified member of clinical psychology of ABEP, which is a very prestigious and difficult honorarium to get. He has had over 25 years of clinical and forensic practice. He conducts psychotherapy and psychoanalysis with children, adolescents, and adults. And related to his book, in his private practice, he conducts competency and criminal responsibility evaluations of criminal defendants, and he conducts commitment evaluations of psychiatric inpatients. Dr. Sternberg also does forensic civil evaluations related, for example, to child custody disputes, personal injury, and he's been qualified as an expert in clinical and forensic psychology in courts throughout the New York metropolitan area. When Dr. Sternberg was at Kirby Forensic Psychiatric Center, he worked as a staff psychologist. And in addition to that, he had an affiliation with New York University's Bellevue Medical Center related to the internship program in clinical psychology. He is a faculty member of the Suffolk Institute of Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis and a faculty member here at the Derner Institute. I want to complete this introduction by reading you just a very short blurb from part of a autobiographical sketch that I was able to see of Dr. Sternberg's. This is related to his book, and he says, "I have often noted that there seem to be two ways that people view mentally ill criminals. Either they dismiss them as nuts, quote unquote nuts, or describe them in technical terminology that conveys very little about what the person is actually like, language that communicates little or nothing to the layman. In my reports, Dr. Sternberg's reports, as well as in this book, my attempt is to explain the mental and emotional lives of these individuals in everyday language, language which turns a nut, quote unquote, into someone recognizable as a human being, even if a disturbed and highly dangerous one. In the book, I do so with an eye toward entertaining as well as informing the reader." The book is incredible. If you haven't read it, especially after hearing today's talk, I urge you to read it. It is educational, it is engrossing. To me, it reads like a novel. I could hardly put it down. And in my mind, it should be required reading for anybody who's studying mental health issues or for the lay public who's interested in this field. So without further ado, I turn the program over to Dr. Richard Sternberg.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sternberg, Richard Sternberg. And Bob, thank you very much for that very nice and generous introduction. I would also like to thank all the people from the Adelphi Society who made this possible. Megan Nolan, Danielle Eisenberg, Elizabeth Sullivan, and Debbie Ramirez, thank you. And I would also like to thank Amira Simha-Alpern, who invited me to do this, and anyone who's connected with Adelphi's graduate program, postgraduate program, owes a debt of gratitude to Amira for all she does for the program. She is Adelphi's Wonder Woman. I would also like to thank all of you for joining today. I appreciate you being here and giving me an opportunity to talk about a book that has been many years in the making. In the late 90s, I worked at the Kirby Forensic Psychiatric Center on Ward's Island in New York City. It is a very special place, a unique kind of place. It's a maximum security forensic psychiatric hospital. There is only one other such hospital in New York State, which is the Mid-Hudson Forensic Psychiatric Center, upstate. Most states have one or two such hospitals. They serve a very special, very particular function. Nobody is admitted to Kirby voluntarily. Nobody would want to be, and nobody is admitted voluntarily. It's also the case that nobody is sentenced to Kirby, in spite of what you may see on Law and Order. I've noticed a couple of times that they have cases in which they supposedly sentence people to 2 years or 5 years or 10 years at Kirby. There's no such thing. That doesn't happen. I will get to how someone does get into Kirby, but maybe I'll start by talking about the different classifications of people who are there. There are three classifications of people. There are people who have been found not guilty by reason of insanity, or actually not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, is how the statute actually reads. That's one class of people. Another class of people are people who have been found incompetent to stand trial. There's a lot of confusion in the general public. There's no particular reason that they should necessarily know the distinction between these different groups, but there is a distinction. If you're found incompetent to stand trial, the adjudication of your criminal case is delayed until you become competent to stand trial. Nobody can go through the procedure of a crime or even a plea agreement until they've been found competent to do so. Once you've been found competent to do that, then the trial can proceed, and one of the possible outcomes is a finding of not guilty by reason of insanity. So these are two groups, the not guilty by reason of insanity and incompetent to stand trial. The third group of people in Kirby is the only group of people who get there without having been charged with a criminal offense. They're called civil patients or Part 57 patients. Part 57 is the part of the New York State mental health law that refers to them. They are sent to Kirby if they have been patients in another New York State hospital, Manhattan State or Creedmoor or Pilgrim State, one of the other state hospitals, and they've been unmanageably violent in one of these hospitals. Then they can be sent to Kirby by court order. So the only way into Kirby is by a court order of one kind or another, either on the basis of having been found not guilty by reason of insanity, or by virtue of being incompetent to stand trial, or by having been unmanageably violent in another state hospital. As I said, nobody is sentenced to Kirby. People are remanded for particular periods of time, and that the period of remand can be renewed repeatedly. The people who have the shortest stay typically are the people who've been found incompetent to stand trial. They've recently been arrested very often, and after a period of being medicated, after a few months, they often can go back to jail and proceed with their cases. The people who are what I call the civil patients, the Part 57 patients, their length of stay can vary tremendously. It can be as short as a few months, or it can go on for years and years. But the people who tend to be there the longest are those who have been found not guilty by reason of insanity. I worked in Kirby in the late 90s. There were people when I was there who had been there for many, many years, and many of them are still there. And some have died there, and more will die there. One of the most people, often think that pleading insanity to a criminal charge is a sort of get out of jail free card. From my point of view, it is anything but. It is a fact that if you're found not guilty by reason of insanity in New York State, you're not sentenced to prison, but you're remanded to Kirby. First, for a 30-day period for an examination, which can be renewed for another 30 days. And then if you're found to be dangerously mentally ill, which is what happens 999 times out of 1,000, you are retained for a further 6-month period. At the end of that 6-month period, if you're still dangerously mentally ill, which is determined by the courts, by the way. The courts, the clinicians submit reports to the court, but it's always a court. It's always a judge who decides whether someone is going to be retained in Kirby or not. So after the first 6 months, you can be retained for a period of a year, an additional period of a year. And then at the end of that year, the retentions become for periods of 2 years, and they can be renewed over and over and over again. When someone comes to Kirby, this is one of the ways that it differs from a prison sentence, and it's one of the ways that makes me feel that it is in no way an avoidance of the consequences of criminal behavior. As a matter of fact, it seems to me that there's a particular kind of hell that's involved in the consequences of your criminal behavior if you plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Because when someone walks into Kirby as an insanity acquittee, they cannot know when or if ever they will leave Kirby. And there are many people there whose lives, who think all day, every day about getting out of there and don't know when or if they ever will. And most of them, or many of them, really don't have a good understanding of what it takes to be discharged from Kirby. But I'll get to that. One of the strange things that happens, working at Kirby is a good way of coming to understand that our legal system is very far from perfect. If you have been convicted or if you have been charged with a very serious crime, a murder or a rape or something like that, you may in a way be better off pleading insanity, because you will, even if you're locked up for the rest of your life, you'll be in a hospital or something that's closer to a hospital anyway, as opposed to a prison. However, something that happens not infrequently, which is really a remarkable thing to think about, is that someone who has been charged with a lesser crime, an assault or a theft or something like that, gets terrible legal advice and decides to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, which, by the way, I should pause for a second and say is always the defendant's choice. The courts cannot make someone plead insanity. The prosecution can't make someone take that plea. The defense attorney can't make someone take that plea. It's always up to the defendant. But the defendant is often advised by a lawyer who is unfortunately ignorant about the realities of what can happen when someone is acquitted on the grounds of insanity. Sometimes a lawyer will have a client, for example, who has committed an assault or a theft or something like that, and he will advise the client, oh, plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Often the lawyer will say it if he thinks the person does have some psychiatric problem. Plead not guilty by reason of insanity, and you'll go to Kirby, you'll go to a forensic psychiatric hospital for 60 days, and that's all. And the person then proceeds with his case in that way, pleads not guilty by reason of insanity, thinking that he's going to be in Kirby or someplace like it for 60 days, and ends up spending decades there. Because there's one standard for getting in and a different standard for getting out. Nobody is discharged, nobody who's found guilty by reason of insanity is discharged from Kirby until they are found to be no longer dangerously mentally ill. So you could theoretically, if you have a certain kind of mental illness that renders you potentially dangerous, you could be arrested for spitting on the sidewalk, plead not guilty by reason of insanity, and end up spending the rest of your life in Kirby. It's a remarkable thing to see, but there are several people during my stay there who those conditions apply to, and it's a terrible thing. But It's a relative rarity, though. Most of the people who are found not guilty by reason of insanity are have committed very, very serious, egregious offenses, and they are where they really need to be. As I said before, it's a very special kind of place. It's half prison and half hospital. I've worked in other psychiatric hospitals, and there is a very real and definite difference. Kirby has a crew of armed security officers that are there at all times. They're not on the wards. They only come to the wards when there's an immediate need. But there's a security team there. Every day, every staff member who comes into the hospital goes through a metal detector and has their briefcase searched. Security is taken very, very seriously. The aides on the wards get special training. They're called SHTAs, Secure Hospital Therapy Aides, and they are trained in how to take patients down, how to intervene when there's violence and put an end to the violence. As soon as violence starts, the security people are called and they rush to the ward, but they're not there at the moment. So it's the aides who are the first line of defense against the violence committed by the patients. And there is violence every day at Kirby, virtually every day. The main victims of the violence are other patients. The patients are they are together all of the time. They're sometimes in a large day room together, or they move together out to the yard of the hospital or to some recreational activity, but they're together. Typically, there are between 20 and 25 patients in the wards, and there are 3 aides, 3 SHTAs watching over them. And there are fights that break out all the time. Interestingly, it's the people who've been found not guilty by reason of insanity who are the least frequent perpetrators of violence, because they tend to be people who are there for long periods of time. They've been medicated, they're sedated to some degree, and they're older. The most violent people, as I said before, are the civil patients, and the young people who've been recently charged with crimes who have been found incompetent to stand trial. They are also more likely to be violent. But these incidents happen all the time. So my stories, the stories in the book are about, even though these different groups of patients in the hospital, my stories are about people who have been found not guilty by reason of insanity. But actually, before I get to that, let me just talk a little bit about what it's like for a psychologist to work at Kirby. It's, in many ways, a rewarding place to work, and in many ways, a very difficult place to work that is not especially rewarding. If you want to learn about severe psychopathology, there's no place better to work. If you're particularly interested in forensic psychology, then you're in the mecca of the world of forensic psychology. So there's no place better to work in terms of that. It's endlessly interesting and fascinating. If you're interested in learning how to think about psychopathology and formalize your thoughts and put them down on paper, it's also a wonderful place to work, because report writing is a major part of a psychologist's work at Kirby. We are constantly being asked to write reports, reports on whether somebody has become competent to stand trial, whether somebody is no longer, if they're a civil patient, are they now rendered harmless enough to be sent back to a non-forensic hospital? Or for the insanity acquittees, are they ready for discharge on the basis of no longer being dangerously mentally ill? So these reports have to be, you're constantly writing these reports. As I said, people are held there for specific and limited periods of retention. And every time the period of retention is up, the case has to come to court and the clinicians have to write reports. So these are, there's a lot that a psychologist can learn and gain from working at Kirby. But there are other ways in which it is, it's very difficult and lacking in the kinds of rewards that you can find in other clinical settings. There isn't that much danger. The danger, as I said, is mainly to other patients.
It's the most boring thing I've ever heard. Last half hour.
I'm sorry. I thought I heard a question. I'm sorry. The danger is mainly to patients and to the aides. The clinicians are not in very much danger, although there have been attacks on clinicians. There were one or two during the time that I was there. One psychiatrist was beaten up pretty badly, but that's a rarity. What makes it difficult for a psychologist is the kinds of relationships that a psychologist is able to establish with the patients, which is very limited for a couple of different reasons. For one thing, patients are told, and they verbally and in writing when they come into the hospital, that there is no such thing as confidentiality within the hospital. Not only is there no such thing as confidentiality, but they are told that anything that they say to a clinician is likely to end up in a report on them, a report that will determine whether they're to be released or not. So it's not hard to imagine how that affects people in terms of their relationships with a therapist. If you're speaking to a therapist and you know that your captivity depends on the therapist's opinion of you, it can be very hard to be forthcoming with that therapist. You're thinking all the time about what kind of an impression you're making on him and what is he going to say that's going to lead to your being discharged from the hospital or being held in the hospital. Not only that, many of the patients there are very heavily medicated. They are people who have, almost by definition, strong antisocial tendencies, and they're not inclined to seek out relationships. They're not inclined to be very open in relationships. They tend to be very guarded in their relationships with people. There are some of the people, as I was talking about, the civil patients, the people who don't have criminal charges against them, but are there because they're dangerous. Some of them are extremely needy and demanding of attention. They want attention from clinicians. They drink it in. They're like a child at the mother's breast. But they want attention of a particular kind. They want to be listened to. They want you to hear their complaints. They may want you to hear stories about what's happened to them recently or from the past, but they are not interested in self-exploration. In the time that I was at Kirby, I worked with one patient who had any degree of a real interest in self-exploration. So as analysts or as just as therapists who are interested in doing insight-oriented or exploratory work, Kirby can be a very frustrating place to work. Not even just in terms of the therapy, but I found it to be a fascinating place, and I found that many of the patients to be extremely interesting people who I wanted to know about and who I wanted to get to know them a little bit, even if not necessarily in a therapeutic way. And it's very difficult to get a patient to most of them, many of them, to be willing to be open, to be willing to be involved in any way with a clinician. So in these ways, it's frustrating and difficult and doesn't have some of the kinds of clinical rewards that you have working in a non-forensic hospital. Another kind of difficulty is when you can establish some kind of relationship with a patient. This happened a couple of times when I was there, but there's one patient who I remember who always comes to mind. It was a very sad situation. A patient who was there as an insanity acquittee, and he was dying to get out of the hospital. And I established at least something of a relationship with him. I wouldn't say that it was insight-oriented therapy, but he would come to my office regularly and we would talk. And as I said, he and everyone else had signed an agreement when he came into the hospital, indicating that he understands that there's no confidentiality in the clinical relationships. Not only did he sign that when he came in, I felt an obligation to tell him repeatedly, I want to work with you. I'm happy to work with you. I suggest that you be as open as you can, but I have to let you know that I will be writing a report on you and I may be testifying in court about you. I feel obligated to let you know that as we proceed. And I would periodically remind him of that. So he knew. And yet he was, he would tell me about things that he was involved in the ward on the hospital and tell me that some of the things he had been thinking about, all of which made him clearly seem to be dangerous and not appropriate for discharge. And he wanted to talk to me. He liked the attention. And we met in an ongoing way with my reminding him periodically about that I would be writing a report and testifying in court. And we proceeded. And sure enough, when I wrote the report and testified in court, and he's present in court and he heard what I had to say, and he became enraged, as if he hadn't been told over and over again what would happen. He became enraged, and it was shortly before I left the hospital. I don't know if we ever could have repaired the relationship if I had stayed, but it was a pretty unpleasant thing to go to. I had something of a therapeutic relationship of a kind with him, and he acted as if I had, this is what he said, that I had turned on him and that I was a snake, etc., for doing what I did. So this is part of what it's like to work at Kirby and to try and function as a therapist. You can, as I said, learn a great deal about people, and it's a fascinating place to work, and you can learn about forensics, but you're not going to be involved in many cases of doing rewarding psychotherapy. It's inherent in the nature of the place. There are also the countertransference that's involved is difficult as well. You're working with people who, everybody there has a long case history, and people had their own ways of going about it, but I always made a point of carefully reading the patient's charts before I started working with them. And they had thick charts. And that was just the most recent relevant material. They had a records room with just, these patients had clinical reports, police reports, court reports. And you're reading about these horrendous things that the people have done. Horrendous crimes to strangers or to family members or whatever. And then you're going and sitting in a room with them to do therapy with them, or trying to anyway. So there's not only, there's what you know about them from their history, there's what they're telling you about. They may be telling you, you know, you've all signed up for this, so I assume you're willing to hear some not so pleasant things, but they may be sitting there telling you about how much they enjoyed gouging out their grandmother's eyes. And you're sitting and listening to it and trying to function as a clinician, as a therapist. So some of the countertransferential issues are very difficult. Some of the patients are telling you how much they hate you and everyone there, and how they wish that they hope that you drop dead before you come to the hospital the next day. So the aggression in so many different forms that exists there, and the place is just suffused with it. It's like something that penetrates every corner of the hospital. And you're working with patients who are telling you about these kinds of situations and trying to feel and trying to be helpful to them, trying to feel that you want to be helpful to people who have these kinds of backgrounds and these kinds of personalities. So it can be very difficult.
Richard, I'm going to, we're kind of at a time where we agreed to open things up to the audience to see if there are questions.
Okay.
And I'm going to use my privilege as moderator to ask a first question or observation. Please. That you mentioned that the patients who are there the longest usually are the NGRI, not guilty by reason of insanity or mental disease or defect.
Yes.
Would you say that that's related to the horrific nature of many of their crimes? For example, in your book, what is it, 3 out of 4, something with really horrible murders that occurred, you know, to release people who, or you know, if someone has done something to a major person in our society, like taking a shot at our president, Ronald Reagan, that's a person who the public is not going to want, for various reasons, to be out on the street again.
Right.
Would you say that that's related to why these individuals are incarcerated or hospitalized for such a long time?
Well, absolutely is the short answer. And that's a wonderful question. But I'm going to have to struggle a bit with how to answer it, because you could write a very long book about that question. You're asking really what is involved in a risk assessment. Risk assessments are a part of what is always going on at Kirby with these, excuse me, with these patients. The question is, do they still have a dangerous mental disorder? In a sense, the horrific nature of the crime that they committed is not necessarily the most important thing. The issue is their ongoing dangerousness. And there are a number of factors that you take into consideration in assessing the dangerousness, one of which is what was the nature of the crime. You're trying to simplify it. You're looking at the nature of the original crime, and you're asking it, trying to assess how likely is the person to commit another such offense. And there's a number of different issues that go into it. one of the difficulties with the patients is that they have trouble often understanding what's being assessed. They say, you hear this all the time there. I've been here for X number of years. I never hurt anybody since I've been here. I haven't been in one fight. I never attacked anyone. What more do you want from me? And what more we want from them is to show that they have some insight into their mental illness, that they have an appreciation of their need to take medication, that they feel some degree of remorse for the crimes they've committed, not just because you want to see people punishing themselves, but you want to see that they appreciate the seriousness of what they've done. And it's a high bar to meet, although it's an interesting thing. I mentioned something about this in the book, that people have very widely varying attitudes about this. Very often when an NGRI patient's retention is over and the hospital has to make a decision about whether to try to retain them or not, there's a disagreement among the clinicians because people have different standards. There are standards written into the law, but they're vague and subjective, and any two people are likely to have two different opinions.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah.
We have so many wonderful questions.
Okay, I'll shut them.
One person, Alessandra Sternberg, do you want to unmute yourself and ask you a question?
Yeah, I was noticing the questions that came after me. Hi, Richard. As a fellow Sternberg, not related at all, it's good to see you here. I wanted you to describe the one patient who did have the ability to reflect, but maybe that's, I think the questions that came after me are better, but.
I tend to, it's not that the questions are better, but your question would take up
it's probably in the book.
Another symposium, which would be fascinating. But there's one question, Richard, Barry Blank, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure, thank you, Bob. Hi, Richard.
Hi, Barry.
Thanks for making the presentation for openers. I have some minimal contact with Kirby. I had done some CE there for the staff years back. But can you describe a typical day for a patient there at Kirby? Thank you.
Yeah. A typical day involves being awakened early in the morning. There's a dormitory where most of the patients sleep. A large area there, and then there are some smaller rooms with 2 or 3 patients in a room. They're awakened in the morning. They go to breakfast in the dining room on the ward. After breakfast, they may sit in the day room for an hour or so. There are different. What's built into most of the days on weekdays is some recreational activity, playing ping pong, playing pool, playing board games, therapy groups, therapy groups of different kinds, depending on the patient's classification. For example, the incompetent to stand trial patients have educational groups, therapy educational groups on the legal system to help them understand what they need to understand to proceed with their cases. But there are other kinds of therapy groups. There are also individual therapy sessions for patients who are able and willing to be involved in it. In decent weather, the patients are taken off the ward every day, if the weather permits, to go out into Kirby's yard. But it's not a huge yard. The whole hospital is surrounded by a razor-wired fence. And so they're contained all the time. So there are activities built into the day. But one of the interesting parts of it is that many of the patients look at the activities as a nuisance. And they would prefer to be allowed to just sit in the day room and stare at the television or stare at the walls or be involved in their own fantasy world, they find some of the scheduled activities to be an annoyance, and they are compelled to be involved in some of these activities. So I hope that answers the question.
Yep. Ajoya, you've asked a wonderful question. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask it?
Sure. Hi, Dr. Sternberg. I'm a
Hi, Ajoya.
supervisee. I was asking on behalf of a friend who couldn't attend today, but just wanting to know kind of some things that contribute to your pathway of becoming of working in forensic settings, and just kind of for someone who's a clinical psychologist, what might be some options for them if they wanted to become a forensic psychologist?
Well, there's different ways of doing it, but I would say that working in Kirby is maybe the best way there is. I pursued a job there particularly because I wanted to learn about forensics. But when you mention being a forensic psychologist, it's important to realize that there are different areas of forensics, and if you there are really three main areas. There's criminal work, there's tort work, civil cases, personal injury, and then there's family issues, custody and divorce issues. And if you're interested in doing custody work, Kirby is not the place for you to go to learn to do that. So how to approach it depends on what kind of forensic work you'd like to do. I'm most familiar with criminal forensic work. I've done a little of some other things, but relatively little. Kirby or a forensic hospital is a wonderful place to work if you want to do criminal forensics, or working with a police department, or a number of other settings like that. Adjoa, if you're serious about it, and you wanted to have a discussion about that, contact me. I'd be happy to talk with you about it. Okay?
Great, thank you. It's for a friend, so I'll pass it on. Thank you so much.
I'd like to add just one thing to help with that answer. The American Board of Forensic Psychology, which is part of the American Psychological Association, has wonderful, wonderful trainings in all the areas that Dr. Sternberg was talking about that forensic psychologists work. And that might be a place, one of the many places that are possible, but a very good place to begin to get some training as a forensic psychologist.
I've been to some of those trainings. They are absolutely wonderful, and you can learn a great deal. I was talking more in terms of how do you establish yourself in a career as a forensic psychologist. The workshops will help you to learn about forensic psychology, though.
So there are many, many more very interesting questions, but if I open it up to more questions, it won't give you the time, Richard, to speak about some of the things you've written about in such a fascinating way in your book. So I'm wondering if you'd like to move forward with doing that, and then we will come back to asking more of these questions.
That would be fine. Thank you, Bob. And sure. Thank you for the questions, everybody. My book has one short introductory chapter, one chapter on Kirby as an institution and on life in the institution. And then there are 4 other chapters, each one devoted to a single case. All 4 are insanity acquittees, NGRIs, people found not guilty by reason of insanity. They are all people who were there when I came and were there when I left. And I got to know them in different degrees and in different ways. As I said before, I made a point of reading the histories, the very extensive histories of the patients that I became involved with. So part of what I know about these patients, I read in their records. Part of what I know about them is from what I observed of them in the hospital. And part of what I learned about them is from what they told me and or what family members told me. One of the difficulties in dealing with this book is that I would have loved to have just written something that was, let me back up just a second and say, the stories are about these individuals, and I attempt in the stories to explain their psychopathology. Not in terms of DSM diagnoses or anything like that, but in terms of sort of from the inside out, so to speak, what they felt, how they saw the world, how their minds worked, what there was about them that led them to committing the terrible crimes that they committed. And I would have loved to make the stories absolutely factual and accurate. I attempted, whether I succeeded or not, I attempted also in the stories to make them entertaining. When I should say, when I wrote the book, it was not written exclusively for mental health professionals, not by any means. I meant it to be an entertaining book for the intelligent lay reading public. That doesn't mean that I didn't want it to be for mental health professionals. I hope mental health professionals would be interested, but it was not written exclusively for them. I wanted the stories to be very entertaining, but nevertheless, I would have liked them to be completely accurate and factual, but that was not possible. These people's criminal histories and the court proceedings are all public record. So there's no confidentiality involved in that. But what I came to know about them during their stays in the hospital, the clinical information that I have, is absolutely privileged information. And I am not permitted to divulge it. So I had to disguise these people, and they are disguised to varying degrees. And there are here and there some fictional elements involved in the stories. But even the disguises that I gave them and the fictional elements that I added to fill in gaps in terms of their life histories and things, I made a very definite effort to make everything be absolutely consistent with what I understood of the individual's personality and psychopathology. So even if something is in some sense not factually accurate, it's psychologically accurate, so to speak, or at least that was my intention. So there are 4 people that I wrote about. Choosing them was very difficult. I came to know hundreds of people during my time there, and get rid of a message on my computer. And there were dozens and dozens that I could have chosen from. It was very hard to choose the particular cases that I would write about, but I chose them because they had interesting life stories and because they illustrated or exemplified interesting kinds of psychopathology. So we have limited time, but I will go through them one by one and give you a sort of a brief overview of each one. The first one is someone who I called Donald Lane. Obviously, I did not use the real names. I opened the chapter on Donald Lane with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem of When She Was Good. It's a poem that most people, or many people, are familiar with the first stanza of it. It goes on beyond that. But the first stanza is, there was a little girl who had a little curl right in the middle of her forehead. When she was good, she was very, very good. And when she was bad, she was horrid. Many people are familiar with that. And it goes on from there, and it talks about the ways that the little girl was horrid and how she was, at least on one occasion, punished for being horrid. And I included that because as I was writing this chapter, I found myself thinking, I was familiar with that poem, and I found myself thinking of it often. It's about splitting. In describing the child, it's a split into two variations of the child's behavior. But the case that I wrote about was someone who, starting from very early in his life, showed a very pronounced tendency to split in his relationships to people, to most especially his mother, but other family members and other people in general. He and his mother had a close, loving, affectionate relationship because of certain family dynamics, which I explain about in the book. They were particularly close and spent a lot of time together and were very loving and affectionate, except for periods of time when this young boy would sometimes, based on some slight incident that happened, sometimes seemingly inexplicably, he would turn against his mother and decide that she was, he act as if he felt that she was evil, and he would hate her, and he would treat her very badly and be vicious to her, at least verbally, to her and to his sisters, who were very much a part of his life. And this is a problem he had very early on in his life. And it came and it went. It was a periodic thing. And his family was always on the alert, and they would go, uh-oh, look at his face. And they would know that an onslaught of hatred was coming, and they all dreaded it. Most of the time he was pleasant and loving, but occasionally. So when he was good, he was very, very good. When he was bad, he was horrid. And that's how he saw his mother. She was the most wonderful mother in the world when he was loving towards her, and she was some sort of a witch when his mood changed. This went on for many years. Then he went away to college, and during his college years, he developed schizophrenia. That's a typical age for someone to become schizophrenic, in late teens, early 20s. And I describe from his point of view and from the family's point of view and from his roommate at college's point of view somewhat, what he went through, what it was like for him to become schizophrenic. This case in particular had sort of special meaning for me because it mirrored something that I went through. When I was in college, I had a pretty close friend who seemed as normal as anyone else and who had a schizophrenic break during our years together in college. And I, over a period of months, watched the remarkable and horrible change that came over this person as he descended into schizophrenia. So this case reminded me of it. So I talk about the details of what happened as he was becoming schizophrenic, his bizarre behavior, his bizarre statements, etc. And he couldn't stay in college because of his illness, and he came home. And I'm not giving away the story because I say at the beginning of this story that he ended up killing his mother, which is what happened. But how and why he did that is a very interesting thing. He had this tendency to split, as I had talked about for many years. But after he became schizophrenic, he developed a syndrome known as Capgras syndrome, which is a pretty unusual thing. It happens mainly in the context of schizophrenia, but it can happen in other disorders. When the person, it was described by a psychiatrist, Joseph Capgras, in the 1920s, who had a patient who insisted that people in his life had been replaced by imposters, which was an absurd idea and there was no reality to it whatsoever, but the patient firmly believed it. This man, Donald Lane, believed that his mother had been replaced by an automaton imposter. And out of rage and hatred of this imposter, he killed her, believing that it was an automaton, that it was not his mother. This has to be seen as the psychotic version, an extreme psychotic version of splitting. This is splitting in which the split is reified, concretized, in more normal kinds of splitting. Somebody may say, you know, sometimes I think you're great, other times the way you act, I hate you, but they don't normally, it's an extreme situation to believe that the person has been replaced by another actual person, not just that they're behaving differently, but that it's another actual, a different person. And that's what this patient believed. This is Capgras syndrome. There are other kinds of misidentification syndromes that are in psychopathology. What makes this, some of them are neurologically based. Oliver Sacks, a neurologist who wrote some wonderful books, talks about some of these syndromes. But in the others, the patient realizes that there's something wrong with him, that he can no longer recognize faces of people he knows or that they look different. They're called misidentification syndromes. With Capgras syndrome, the patient does not realize that the difficulty is in himself. He believes that the difficulty is that this other person has been replaced by someone else. So he believed that, and I'm not going to go into the details of how, it's all in the book, but he killed her. And he claimed then, this is now many years ago, and it was when I got to know him, it was a number of years afterwards, he still insisted that he had not killed his mother. He had killed an automaton. And he understood, as all people in Kirby do, that if he's ever going to be discharged, one of the most basic requirements is that he recognize the reality of what he did and have some recognition of it, some insight into it, and some remorse for it. So by insisting that he hadn't killed his mother, he had only killed an automaton, he knew he was sealing his fate to stay in Kirby, but he insisted that right till the end. So he is story number one.
Richard, I'm going to interject here. There are so many wonderful questions. So if we could take a few minutes before you go on to some of the other stories. Maureen Shada, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
I'm fascinated by the little tidbits that you're sharing with us. And I'm just wondering, how many of these patients that you work with, do you get any background in terms of their very early childhood experience? You did just explain that one patient who had a seemingly great relationship with his mom, and it sounded like maybe there was something more organic, internally going on for him. But do the bulk of your patients tend to have significant trauma early on, or I'm just curious?
That's a very good question, but not necessarily. Some did, but some didn't. My personal sense is that psychosis is. I think of the diathesis stress model makes a lot of sense to me. That there's some sort of constitutional, genetic, or inborn potential to become psychotic, and then stress or difficult environmental circumstances lead to the actual outbreak of psychosis. This person had a very difficult childhood. His father left the family very early in his life. He was a couple of years old. And his mother went through periods of very deep depression. So she would, in effect, sort of, from his point of view at least, abandon the family periodically, take to her bed and stay there for weeks at a time. And he was raised by his, during those periods of time, by his older sisters. So you certainly could look at that as a traumatic situation. And not only as a traumatic situation, it's tempting. I don't offer conclusions in the book about the etiology of things, but it's certainly tempting to think that this relationship with his mother, in which she was present and loving and available for a period of time, and then every so often disappear for a couple of weeks into a depressive episode, that this might be connected with his splitting in the way that he did. But the patients had very different kinds of backgrounds, some with serious trauma, some with a lot of abuse, some with trauma that was not of an abusive nature. It varied a lot. And I gathered the information in various ways. Some information was from the charts, some information was from the patients, some information was from the patient's family. In this case, I got some information from the patient's sisters. So,
Maureen, your question, which included a reference to the ACE, the Adverse Childhood Experience, is a wonderful, wonderful research question that a place like Kirby could look into by their research staff. It's a wonderful, wonderful question. In the interest of time, let's move on. Brent Willock, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Well, thank you, Robert. And thanks to everyone for this great afternoon. My question for Richard had to do with whether he thinks a hospital like Kirby could or should be structured differently so that the therapist could have a non-reporting relationship with the rest of the institution, such that the patients would not have that obstacle that he describes so well, of feeling anything they say can and perhaps will be used against them in reports for the courts and so forth. So first question, can or should the therapist relationship be structured differently? And if so, how does one make it safe for the therapist to work with people who, for example, take pleasure in gouging out eyeballs? How does one make it safe for a therapist to work with them if they came to treatment?
Well, that's another excellent question. My screen froze for a second, so I may have missed part of your question, but I think I got the gist of it. I don't know how it would be possible to arrange things so that the patients could feel free to speak in therapy without having the feeling that what they're saying could be used against them. Theoretically, I suppose you could set aside some relationships, some therapeutic relationships, and have someone be assigned to be a therapist who's allowed to keep the information confidential. That's not the way it was. And there are various reasons that people would object to doing that. I don't know how the laws might play out with that, but I can imagine that the public would not like that. One of the functions of a hospital like Kirby is to protect the public from these people. So I can easily imagine people saying, well, how can you allow yourselves to know things about these patients that pertain to their dangerousness and keep that to yourself and not use it in terms of as part of making a decision about whether they're to be discharged or not. So as far as the safety for the therapist, that's an ongoing question. There are certain things you can do. The first thing that you have to do is try to use good judgment. You have good clinical judgment in terms of who you can be with and under what circumstances. And there are certain practical arrangements you can, it was always suggested, and I tried to do it, that anytime you're working with anyone who can be dangerous, it's ideal to arrange the furniture so that both the therapist and the patient have access to the doorway without having to pass the other person, so that the therapist can run out of the room without passing the patient can run out without passing the therapist. These were small offices, though, and it wasn't always possible to do that, but we would try. There were very few times when I felt in danger. The 1 or 2 times when I did, I opened the door to my office and sort of signaled to one of the aides down the hall that I was feeling a little uncomfortable. And he would walk closer to my office, and if I had called out in any way, he would have run in. But using judgment about who to speak with and under what circumstances is the main defense. Attacks on clinicians were not frequent, but they did happen occasionally. So.
Thank you, Richard. Moving on, Gary Brucey, your question sounds like it could be political, but it also sounds like there's much more to it than just a political reference. So
absolutely.
Can you
first of all, I'll mute myself. No, first of all, Richard, I cannot tell you how much I enjoyed your book. I am one of these people who is totally into forensic psychology. I got a whole library behind me. Ask me anything about a serial killer, and I'll tell you. I just loved the book. It read like a novel, you know, and you included all the attachment theory, all the really hardcore psychoanalytic stuff, and you wrote it in English, and I thank you for that. I really enjoyed it. It's a real page turner. You hit a home run, in my opinion.
Thank you very much.
I see it was published in 2020.
Yes.
I wonder if you wrote any of it while Donald Trump was president. And I'm a little concerned about people talking about organicity. I mean, I certainly believe in organicity, but if we all read Mary Trump's book, An Adelphian, she had a seat at the table and there was no organicity there.
Yeah.
It was flat out environmental, parental, family dynamics. Okay. I'm particularly interested in the David Reardon character you wrote, because he was, to me, a pure sociopath. And I wonder if you've come to the conclusion that, or do you think that there is a particular sociopathic family dynamic to someone like David Reardon or Donald Trump, who, by the way, has caused more damage than anybody you wrote about?
Well, that may very well be. Yes.
Easily 200,000 deaths. I'm not going to go on because I can get on a tirade. But
let's let Richard respond.
I think it's an interesting, it's an excellent question, and thank you very much for your comments about the book. I certainly think that there are family environments that are pathogenic. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I also think, and David Reardon really illustrates it, that there's a strong constitutional element, both in terms of psychosis and in terms of psychopathy in Reardon's case. Reardon's family background was in no way terrible. It was in no way terrible. And it's a very interesting thing about psychopathy, which we don't really have time to go into in the way it would be nice to be able to go into it. But in talking about antisocial personality and psychopathy, to sort of oversimplify it, psychopathy is if you take the universe of people with antisocial personality, only a small portion of them will be psychopaths. It's something beyond just being antisocial. And there is writing to suggest by some of the most eminent experts in the field these days, Robert Hare, J. Reed Malloy, if you know these people, that suggest that the most hardcore psychopaths, the people who are the truest, purest, so to speak, psychopaths, there's something constitutional about it, something that they're born with or born without, so that even in a healthy family, a healthy and and nurturing family environment, they go off the rails in the way they do. In the book, I write about that somewhat. There's I'm getting ahead of things, but I'm not going to have time to go through all the cases anyway, so maybe I will let myself get ahead of things. In hardcore psychopathy, J. Reed Malloy, who's one of the experts in the field, says that he feels that the fundamental problem, the basic problem, is what he calls a fundamental disidentification with humanity, which I think is a wonderful way of saying something that I think really does apply to psychopaths. And I write about that in the book, how that disidentification with humanity leads to psychopathy, how it leads to the grossly deformed superego and the lack of a conscience. And I had a personal conversation with Robert Hare about this. And what he says and fits with what Malloy says and the way it seems to me, that there's some way in which the child from a very early age just does not resonate with or identify with the parents in the way that he needs to in order to develop psychologically appropriately in terms of superego development and other areas as well. It's just something is missing in the child so that the parents can be good parents, but the child doesn't take them in as if they're good parent, doesn't absorb from them what a child needs to absorb in the process of development. In the book, I compared it to somebody who has a lung disease. They can be in an environment that's perfectly oxygen rich, clean, pure, clean, good air. But because of a problem in their lungs, they can't take in the oxygen that they need. And that seems to be the case in hardcore psychopathy, that there's a way in which a psychopath, starting from a very early age, does not identify with the parents, and as an adult, in a sense, doesn't identify with humanity. He's a separate breed of creature, which makes him entitled to do whatever he wants to do to these other beings, which are of a different order than he is. In the book, I compared it to the way I might feel towards a pair of shoes. I don't worry about the feelings that my shoes have. I wear them as long as they work for me and they're comfortable. When I'm done with them, I throw them out because I'm not a shoe and they're not people. And this seems to be, in a sense, the way psychopaths see other human beings. They're objects for their amusement.
Wonderful. With such good questions, such wonderful answers. Let's see if we can fit in just a couple more questions. Amira, you had a question. Would you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, Richard. Thank you for this fascinating book. I wanted to know what would be the nature of the therapeutic work when people in this setting? What is the therapeutic aim? What is the nature of therapeutic beyond the assessment?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I would have liked to go into it if I had more time. It depends on what the reason why the person is at Kirby. For competency patients, the focus is on mostly medication, and then therapy is really more a matter of education with competency patients. You want to help them to understand the charges against them, help them to be able to understand the court proceedings, help them to be able to work with their attorney. So it partially depends on what their particular difficulty is that makes them unable to appreciate these things, unable to work with their attorney, and you want to try to resolve that to the extent that you can. With civil patients, the ones who are just out of control, dangerous, again, medication is the first weapon in the armamentarium. And then in therapy, you want to just do what you can to calm them down, to help them they're like infants, these people. They're like terrified infants. And they are, if you can give them something to hold on to in terms of a human relationship that in some way feels good to them, you can put out some of the fire of their rage. At least that's the attempt. It's not about insight, except to the extent that it's about the cognitive insight. You can't keep attacking people. If you keep jumping on people and punching them in the face, you're going to have to stay in this hospital. You have to learn to control your behavior. It's about behavioral control. With the NGRI patients, it's something that's really, it's more ambitious. It's about getting them to be able to recognize what they've done, recognize something about what made them do it. And I'm not talking about deep psychoanalytic insight. I'm talking about something much simpler than that. We got them to recognize what triggered their antisocial, violent behavior, and to get them to understand it and to understand what means they might have of controlling it. To get them to understand the importance of medication, to get to understand the importance of taking steps to intervene if they feel themselves losing control of themselves in terms of their anger or their delusionality. So it really depends on what the person is there for and what their particular problems they have. But the goals therapeutically are very, very limited. It's nothing like what we are looking to do with the patients who we work with in our private practices. It's a very different kind of therapy.
Richard, thank you so much. I'm thinking that with all of this, I mean, there's tremendous interest on the part of people asking a lot of questions that we won't unfortunately have time to get to. Somewhere here on Long Island, I think somebody ought to be thinking about developing a forensic training program. I'm not going to point fingers at who, but Richard, we've got, I'm going to hold off with asking people to state their questions because we've got just 2 or 3 minutes. I know there hasn't been time for you to discuss the fascinating cases in your book more than the first case. Was there anything you'd like to say to wrap things up, to give you the last word in 2 or 3 minutes? In the 2 or 3 minutes that we have.
Just to sort of give people some idea of what's in the book there, I talked about the case of the young man who killed his mother. I talked a little bit in response to a question about psychopathy. The last chapter of the book, David Reardon, is about an astounding, a truly astounding human being in his gratuitous cruelty. And I found him to be one of the most amazing and interesting characters in the hospital. There's one of the other 2 stories is about a sexual offender who committed every variety of sexual offense that you can imagine almost, while without being technically psychotic, convincing himself that he was a good guy who just was in love with women. He loved women, so he couldn't help being a voyeur and an exhibitionist and a sexual sadist and someone who grabbed women in subway cars, and ultimately a rapist. He committed a rape, truly making himself believe, and it was not date rape, it was a stranger, but making himself believe that this was a romantic encounter. And the 4th case is of someone who was very unusual in Kirby in that he had actually, he was a brilliant man who had had serious accomplishments in his field, the field of intellectual endeavor, which I disguised in the book, before he had a psychotic break. and committed a very terrible crime. And he was someone who just lived in a fantasy world. I would love to have time to talk about it, but lived in a fantasy world from the time he was a small child until as of the last time I saw him at Kirby. I would wrap up by saying that it's just an endlessly fascinating place, and these are endlessly fascinating people. They're people you don't want to hang out with, but they're people who are just fascinating to know about. I was very sad when I left Kirby, and if they had allowed, there were other things I wanted to do. I was starting private practice, etc. But if they had allowed part-time employees, I probably would have stayed a much longer time. What you can learn there is just endlessly fascinating. And I thank you all for listening.
Richard, you've written a fascinating book. You've given a wonderful talk on it this afternoon. Thank you so much. Megan, do you want to wrap things up and help us with CEUs and anything else?
Absolutely. Thank you. Today's presentation has been such a treat. Thanks so much, Richard and Bob. I'd also like to thank Elizabeth Sullivan, our treasurer, Danielle Eisenberg, our secretary, and Debbie Ramirez, our liaison officer for the ASPP committees, for all the hard work that they've done in putting this event together.